What up guys, Dreadshells here and welcome back to World of Tanks. Today we're going to be doing another scout review and we will be looking at the Tier 7 Russian scout tank, the LTTB. Now this scout tank was introduced back in patch 9.3 along with several other new scout tanks, notably the M41 Walker Bulldog and the RU-251 Speerpanzer. So it's been in the game for a while, and if you guys haven't already researched and purchased this tank yourself, you've probably run into a fair number of this tank out on the battlefield over the past year or so that it has been in the game. So what I will be covering in this video is this vehicle's history, its statistics, especially compared to other Tier 7 scouts, its strengths, its weaknesses, the recommended playstyle for this tank, and any equipment choices and crew skill recommendations. So let's just get started. So back in 1940, the Russians had designed the T-34, a very good tank. It had excellent mobility and was armed originally with the L11 76.2mm gun, which was later replaced by a higher performing 76mm, the F-34 version. So as the war progressed and the Germans saw the success of the T-34 out on the battlefield, they realized that they needed to go back to the drawing board and design a superior tank model. And from these efforts, the Panther and Tiger tanks came into being. Now, both of these tanks had good armor and very high performing guns, most notably the Tiger mounted with the 88mm long barrel KWK-36 gun. After the Battle of Kursk, it became apparent to the Russians that they needed a more competitive gun than the 76 F-34 that was currently mounted in the T-34 and T-43 tank models. And since the T-43's turret gun mount was originally designed to house the F-34 76mm gun, plus some mobility problems as the Russians tried to put more armor on the tank, they realized that they needed to come up with a completely new tank model from scratch. And this is where the design for the LTTB and the T-34-85 comes in. Now, the design for the LTTB actually never made it past blueprint stage, and in fact, the tank was never actually fully designed. The only part of the tank that was drawn was the chassis. There was actually no turret or specified gun called for on the tank. And the LTTB tank model project was eventually scrapped in 1944, and the Russian engineers went with the T-34-85 tank model, which mounted the D5 and eventually the D5T 85mm gun. So the LTTB never made it past blueprint stage, it never made it past prototype stage, and it was never put into production, and it was never put into service. So that is the history of the tank, or lack thereof, depending on your perspective. Now let's jump into some statistics and into some gameplay. And the first two stats that we're going to be looking at for the LTTB are its view range and its camo rating, two of the most important attributes to a scout tank. Now the LTTB has 390 meters base view range, which is pretty average for a Tier 7 scout tank. In fact, most of the Tier 7 scout tanks have 390 meters base view range, with the exception of the M41 Walker Bulldog, T71, and SP1C, which all have 400 meters base view range. And the LTTB gets 15.39% camo rating, which is actually kind of on the low side of camo rating as far as Tier 7 scouts are concerned. The AMX 1357 gets 18.75% camo rating. So if you guys don't know how camo rating works, basically, just simplified, the higher the number of your camo rating, the better the camo rating is. And if you guys don't know how the actual camo rating mechanic works itself, I link a forum thread once again in every one of my videos called The Mystery of Camo and Spotting. It explains how spotting and camo rating work and how they interact with each other so that you know at what distance enemies will spot you, or you will spot your enemies depending on their camo rating or their view range. And going into the mobility stats for the LTTB, this is where this tank really starts to shine. It has the second best top speed of any Tier 7 Scout in the game at 68 kilometers per hour. And while the M41 Walker Bulldog does have a better top speed at 72 kilometers per hour, the LTTB actually gets a much better horsepower to ton ratio. The LTTB gets a 31.21 horsepower to ton ratio, which is extremely good. It's one of the best attributes of this tank. And to put it into perspective, the M41 Walker Bulldog, which we all think of as extremely fast, only gets a 23.66 horsepower to ton ratio. And off the top of my head, I can only think of two other tanks in the game that have a higher horsepower to ton ratio than the LTTB, those being the ELC AMX, the Tier 5 French Scout, and the AMX CDC, the French Tier 8 medium premium tank. So while the LTTB may not have quite the same top speed that the M41 Walker Bulldog does, it still has an extremely healthy top speed at 68 kilometers per hour, and its 700 horsepower engine means that it has a very, very good 31.21 horsepower to ton ratio, outclassing every other Tier 7 Scout tank in the game by a mile when it comes to horsepower to ton ratio. This combined with healthy terrain resistance stats, adequate hull traverse stats, and very healthy turret traverse stats means that this tank's strengths on the battlefield are early positioning and relocation. Now, of course, you should be trying to do these things in any scout tank that you play, depending on the battle situation and what is going on in any particular game. But this tank really, really shines and excels at relocating quickly from flank to flank to get better vision on opponents and to get better firing angles on its opponents. So to play this tank effectively and successfully, you really, really need to be playing it according to these strengths. And one other thing here to note about the application of the very good mobility of this Tier 7 Russian Scout tank is that it's actually very, very good not only at active scouting, roll scouting ridge lines, but it's also very good at getting into certain passive spotting positions. Because its acceleration is very good because of its extremely good horsepower to ton ratio and its healthy terrain resistance stats, you can get into early passive spotting positions very quickly in this vehicle. And going into the gun stats for this tank's final gun is the 85mm D1085. Its penetration is 170 millimeters with AP rounds, 216 millimeters of penetration with APCR rounds, and 44 millimeters of penetration with HE rounds. It is one of the more accurate Tier 7 Scouts in the game, coming in at .36 accuracy, and the aim time is a healthy 2.1 seconds. Now, I recommend that even though this tank's accuracy and aim time stats are pretty healthy, that you still train Snapshot, Smooth Ride, and Brothers in Arms on your crew for this vehicle. You'll find yourself shooting a lot of targets on the move or constantly re-aiming because you have just relocated to a better firing position. The LTTB also gets a very healthy 2,208 damage per minute, which is only second to the Wheezy 131 for Tier 7 Scouts. So this tank can put the hurt out in a hurry if you can get your gun on target and get your shells to penetrate. And its reload time is 4.89 seconds. Now, of course, you can lower this with equipment such as rammer and vents, or Brothers in Arms for crew skills. Now, another important thing to note about the LTTB's gun is that it only gets 3 degrees of gun depression, which is one of the major gripe points that people who don't like this scout tank have. Personally, I don't think it's that big of a deal when it comes to the bad gun depression of this tank. Although it is awkward to engage targets over ridge lines and over hills in this vehicle, because this tank is so fast and so agile, you should be dictating where and when you are engaging your targets. So if you are trying to trade shots with a medium tank or another light tank that has much better gun depression than you over a ridge line, you are doing it wrong. Either you stay in a bush and try to spot the enemy and stay invisible, or you try to relocate to get a better angle on your target so that you can use the gun. Once again, the strength of this tank is its agility and mobility, and this is how you can work around the bad gun depression of this tank. Now, one other interesting thing to note about this tank when it comes to the gun is its damage per shot. Its damage per shot with AP and APCR is 180 damage, but it gets a whopping 300 damage per shot with HE shells. So even though this tank doesn't get the highest ammo capacity, I would recommend throwing in a few HE shells because you will be doing a huge amount of damage very quickly to soft targets such as the Waffenträger E100. And lastly, covering the survivability of this tank, it has a very healthy 950 hit point pool. And it also has some interesting armor stats. Now, normally we wouldn't be talking about armor on a tier 7 scout tank, but this tank has actually respectable armor considering the tier and class of vehicle it is. It has 90mm of armor at the front of the turret, 75mm of armor at the side of the turret, and 52mm of armor at the rear of the turret. Also, when it comes to the gun mantlet, the gun mantlet is also very strong, ranging in between 120 to 140mm of effective armor, all the way up to over 200mm of effective armor in places when you factor in the spaced armor and nominal armor values combined. Now, when it comes to the armor values of the hull, it gets 90mm of armor at the front, 45mm of armor at the side, and 40mm of armor at the rear. But because of the angling of the armor plates of this tank, you can actually get some ridiculous effective armor values at certain angles. Say for instance you're driving around a corner, or is more often the case with this tank when you get bounces in it, an enemy tank does not hit you center of your mass with its shot. So for instance, if it leads its shot too much when you're driving sideways to them and hits your upper plate, you actually have a crazy 228mm of effective armor at this angle. Also, if you're driving straight at your enemy or straight away from your enemy and he doesn't hit his shot center to mass, you can get some crazy bounces off the side armor plates. You get anywhere from 100 to over 250mm of effective armor off the side. So I've actually bounced some ridiculous shots in this vehicle. And another interesting thing to note about this tank when it comes to survivability are the tracks. Because the tank profile is so narrow, the track width is actually a large portion of the front or rear view of the tank. So if an enemy tank does not hit you center to mass, once again, a decent number of the shots may end up only tracking you and not actually doing damage to you. And for this reason, I would recommend probably training repairs on either your third or your fourth skill depending on your preference. Also, one last thing to note about this tank's survivability is its profile. And a tank's profile influences your ability to avoid enemy fire, especially at longer ranges. Looking at the M41 Walker Bulldog here and comparing it to the LTTB, we can see that the LTTB is a much narrower profile tank, which means that it will be much easier to dodge enemy shells by zigzagging back and forth in this vehicle. Also, looking at the M41 Walker Bulldog from the side and comparing it to the LTTB, we can see that even the height is slightly shorter than the Walker Bulldog. So once again, you are a smaller profile target, albeit a small one compared to the M41 Walker Bulldog, but that still means that it's easier for you to dodge incoming enemy fire if you are quick on your toes. So that covers all the essential stats of the tank. Let's dive into some gameplay. So here we are on Stalingrad. I was showing a game earlier on Fiery Salient in the background as I was talking about the statistics of this tank to give you guys an idea about the passive spotting and active spotting potential of this vehicle, and also the mobility of this vehicle when it comes to open maps. But I also wanted to show you guys the strengths of this vehicle when it comes to maps that aren't traditionally known for being scout friendly, particularly choke point and city maps. So analyzing the team compositions here real quick before we get started, we can see that we are in quite a nice matchup, a tier 7 scout tank and a tier 8 game, so it's really nice when it comes to tiering. Also, there is no artillery, which also makes it very nice. I don't have to worry about staying in cover in certain positions until I'm unlit. And as far as the distribution of tank classes on both sides, there's about an even distribution of heavy tanks, tank destroyers, and medium tanks on each side. And as far as light tanks are concerned, I am the only scout tank on my team, and there's only one scout on the enemy team in the M41 Walker Bulldog. So knowing that we have such a good matchup when it comes to tiering, as a scout tank, the better matchmaking you get in a game when it comes to tiering, the higher obligation you have not only to do spotting and assistance damage to your team, but also direct damage. So let's just get started. Now, it's important as a scout tank to use your mobility and your speed to try and get vision on the enemy team. Even on choke point maps and on city maps like Stalingrad, because even if you don't get any assistance damage out of the spotting, you get an idea of the dispersion of the enemy team, and your teammates can make better decisions on where to position themselves, and you can make better decisions on where to position yourself as well. So we pop over here to the 8 line to see any quick tanks that might be coming down the beach side. And you can see there that I didn't actually get lit until I fired. So even though that E25 was only about slightly under 300 meters away, he didn't spot us until we fired. Now I see that the E25 on my team is in trouble fighting this T-34, so I decide to come and help. We also have our T-34-3 coming up on my right, so I want to try and save my teammate if I can. Even though he made a bad decision, I'm in a position to help him without too much risk to myself, so I need to try and save him if I can, and we do. Now looking at the map there, the enemy team have a whole bunch of tanks there on the G line and the 7 lines, and I have no supporting angle of attack from any of my teammates, so I need to relocate. The enemy team don't seem to have put any of their tanks on the 1, 2, 3 lines, which is good for us, as long as our team takes advantage of it. And this is where the speed and the agility of this tank in relocating to better angles of attack comes into play. My position is compromised, I don't have the health point pool or good enough armor to stand my ground, and there's just too much of the enemy there. So I feel bad in leaving my teammates there to inevitably die, but this is the better decision. So we relocate and try to help our western flank take out enemy tanks as quickly as possible. And we get behind this Tiger and start pumping shots into him. As you can see here, you can put the damage out in a hurry in this tank if you get free shots on your enemy vehicles. We stay there until the Tiger turns his gun towards us. We managed to get a few shots into him. VK misses us, so we stop and take a shot at him, and it hits. Once again, relocating to different angles and unexpected angles. The E25 was waiting for us, but as you can see, even though I'm a light tank, at certain angles I can bounce some shots, and I bounced a shot for the E25. And now I'm trying to relocate and flank this VK and E25 to get him trapped between two flanks. I'm suffering from some bad ping there. As you see, my shot went way right from where my reticle was aimed. And I leave the E25 to die because I think my teammates can handle him on their own, and they do. And this VK is killing a AFK Hellcat that we had in our cap. And now I'm just going to circle him and try to stay away from his gun, using my excellent horsepower to ton ratio and my good traverse just to stay away from his gun. And you can see the agility of this tank at work here, even though this guy doesn't seem to be a good player. You can do that with a wide variety of sluggish enemy opponents, either heavy tanks or tank destroyers. Also, you have the rate of fire and the alpha damage to track your enemy opponents to make your agility in circling your opponents even more effective. So now it's still a really close game, so I need to be continuing to put as much pressure on the enemy as possible. That was kind of a bad shot there, shooting the side armor of the T-43. So I go for his turret again. Unfortunately, that bounced. But our IS backs us up and takes him out. I saved my repair kit because I don't know if I might get ammo racked later on in the game. This tank does get ammo racked fairly often, and the best way to avoid that in a light tank is just to not get shot at all. And our team does a great job there at teaming up on the Wheezy 111, and we get him killed. KB-13 tries to be really sneaky and come up behind us, but we spot him on the mini-map and swivel back to the left to dodge his shell. I deliberately stood there and took that shot so I could put my own shot in and help reduce his hit point pool so he can potentially become a one-shot for one of my teammates. And now I'm just going for the Bulldog here. I saw him flanking around. And he decided to ram me to death, but I also rammed him to death, so that was a good enough trade. Both the enemy tanks on the battlefield are fairly low health, and our team end up winning the game. So hopefully you saw the speed and the agility of this tank and its ability to relocate to different positions and different flanks to get better angles of vision and better angles of attack on its enemy. Even though this map is a city map, those concepts still apply. You can apply those concepts to any map. It's a lot easier to do it on open maps, of course, like Redshire, Prokhorovka, Malinovka. But try to use the speed and the agility of this tank to work around its bad gun depression and to outplay slower, sluggish opponents. Be constantly using the speed and the agility of this tank to relocate, to get better positions of attack on your enemies, once again to get better vision lanes on your enemies, and to also maybe outcircle your enemies when it comes to slow enough enemy targets such as tank destroyers or slow heavy tanks. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. As far as recommended crew skills, Brothers in Arms, full camo of course, because it's a scout tank. Scout tanks keep 100% of their camo rating while on the move, while other tanks don't. So it's always good to take a full advantage of that camo rating value. If you have 100% camo on your crew, it doubles the value of your base camo rating. So in this case, for the LTTB, it would be around 31% camo rating while on the move. And your camo rating only drops when you fire your gun. And as far as equipment choices are concerned, I would go with coated optics over binocs, simply because that if you are playing this tank super static to take advantage of your binocs, you're doing it an injustice. This tank is extremely fast and extremely agile, and its strength is positioning and repositioning and flanking, and you need to be constantly moving in this vehicle to be successful in it. So coated optics over binocs. Vents, unfortunately this tank cannot use vertical stabilizers, otherwise I would use it. So improve ventilation to buff your whole crew a little bit. And finally I would put a medium caliber tank gun rammer on it to maximize one of the other major strengths of this vehicle, which is its damage per minute. So once again, I hope you guys enjoyed watching this review on the LTTB, the Tier 7 Russian Scout Tank, and learn more about its strengths and its weaknesses. and how to play this tank to best effect. I personally love the Scout tank to death. It's one of my most favorite Scout tanks in the game. With its speed and its agility, it feels like you're riding a roller coaster over the battlefield at times, and it's a lot of fun to drive, and it's a lot of fun to play. So, thank you guys so much for watching. Good luck out there on the battlefield, and take care.